By mid-July, there were 1,000 people dying in London each week. By September, it was up to 1,000 a day. A Londoner named Samuel Pepys wrote in his diary, "But now, how few people I see, and those walking like people that have taken leave of the world." Samuel was a successful businessman, but unlike most wealthy people, he didn't leave London during the plague. Instead, he stayed and recorded his impressions in his diary, which was published almost 2 centuries later. It is one of the most revealing records of what life was like for people in London during that terrible year. In the fall, with plague raging across the city, Samuel wrote, "Lord, how empty the streets are and melancholy. So many poor sick people in the streets, full of sores, and so many sad stories overheard as I walk. Everybody talking of this dead and that sick man sick, and so many in this place and so many in that. And they tell me that in Westminster there is never a physician and but one apothecary left, all being dead, but that there are great hopes of a great decrease this week. God send it." Sure enough, as fall turned to winter and the weather became colder, and the plague deaths began to subside. At the end of the year, as people began cautiously returning to the city, John Grant published his analysis of the epidemic, called London's Dreadful Visitation, or a collection of all the bills of mortality for this present year. It estimated that 68,000 people out of a population of 450,000 had died of plague. In a single year, the disease had wiped out 15% of London's population. New knowledge, but no cure. By looking carefully at statistics, John Grant helped people realize that epidemics could be predicted. High numbers of unusual deaths might point to the start of an outbreak of disease. People no longer had to look to the stars for signs of a coming epidemic. They just had to pay attention to what was happening around them. It was the beginning of a more scientific approach to disease control and prevention. Still, much about plague remained a puzzle in 1665. How did the disease start? How did it spread? Did you catch it from breathing infected air? From contact with a victim? Could you get it from something you ate or drank? There were no answers to these questions, which made preventing and treating plague a risky guessing game. To avoid catching plague, some doctors held gold coins in their mouths while they treated patients, believing the precious metals protected them. Others recommended burning herbs and spices mixed with vinegar or tar to clean the air. So many people believed that smoking tobacco would prevent plague that schoolboys were punished if they forgot to smoke each morning before their prayers. Some people wore amulets filled with toad poison to ward off the disease. And con artists sold worthless powders and mixtures, passing them off as exotic wonder drugs. Powdered unicorn horn, phoenix eggs, and the kidney stones of camels. There was no way to cure plague, and doctors could do little to treat it. Bleeding had been recommended as a cure for fevers since ancient Greek and Roman times. Although people often died from loss of blood, doctors continued to bleed their patients. Sweating was another common treatment. It was based on the idea that because plague caused fevers, it should be treated with heat. Doctors piled on blankets and stoked up a fire near the victim's bed, hoping that their patient would sweat out the plague poison. If neither bleeding nor sweating worked, there was opium to dull your pain, if you could afford it. When that failed, there was only prayer left. According to John Grant's statistics, there were only 9,967 births in London that year, compared to 97,306 burials. Some wondered if the city's population would ever recover. John pointed out that London was an incredibly dangerous place to live at all times. Every year there were far more deaths in the city than there were births, and yet the population continued to grow because people from surrounding countryside were constantly coming to London looking for work and a better life. John predicted that within a few years, London's population would rebound, thanks to newcomers from the country. Again, he was right. Slowly, life began to return to normal in the city as people forgot the year of terror and death. And I'm British.